We're here with Charles Christianson, our main gallery exhibiting artist. Chuck is from Fergus Falls, Minnesota, and lives in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. So welcome, Chuck.
Thank you.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started working in abstracts?
Sure. I was born in Fergus in 1958 and have lived here most of my life, except for one summer when I was in college. I worked in Alaska, and then when I was in school, I was gone for a few years. But other than that, yeah, most of my life I lived and worked here.
Nice.
And as far as my painting, I went to school thinking I wanted to be an artist. This is college, but I wasn't real comfortable telling people I wanted to do that. So, but that's really what my passion was. I think even when I was a little kid, I was always interested in art and in drawing and creating things. But I think a big influence in my life, for sure, probably the biggest, would be Charles Beck when I started going to community college. And it was good to see a teacher who was a working artist, and his life was about art. I remember being invited to his house, the whole group of students. And we had a really good group of students that year. There was a lot of really serious students. And we got invited to his studio in his house and got to see how, everything was kind of integrated around his art, the house, and the beautiful studio, his little gallery he had, and how it was all intertwined with who he was. And it was a very important influence on me. And we became good friends over the years, and he was a major influence on me. I think like a lot of artists, you start out, as a representational artist, and that was certainly the case with me. I remember as a child, I would be drawing animals, but I also had this thing where I would be making little sculptures out of blocks of wood, and they were sometimes looked like boats, and sometimes were just kind of assemblages of pieces that didn't really represent anything. So I think I've always had an eye for abstraction. I remember going to the Walker Art Center on a school trip in sixth grade and being very fascinated by abstraction. I remember some of the wall paintings were, just very fascinating to me. So there's always been that, bend to maybe abstraction. But initially, like I said, I drew representational. I still draw representationally just as an exercise. Before COVID, we had a drawing group in town, and the cats was a big part of that. And so, I have actually literally thousands of drawings of figures in my drawers. And then then after I was into drawing, I was very much a representational painter. I had a show at the college, probably about 20 years ago. That was my early work. And the interesting thing about that, I was doing some of this work that's on the wall back as early as 1982, but I was looking at it more as experimental. So I never really showed this work at all early on. It was all my representational stuff. So it's kind of evolved. I got back in the early '80s. I was after I graduated from college. Beck was really encouraging me to go to grad school at Iowa, and that was my intent. So I was going to take a year and just paint on my own. So I built a studio and started working. And after a year, I decided that, you can really learn anything. You can learn everything on your own. It might teach you there faster to go to grad school, but it's going to cost you a pile of money. And if you're not going to teach, then what's the point? So I decided not to go, and I took a job as a carpenter, and I learned to do everything. And I think, including drywall, and I think the drywall end of it was interesting because a lot of the stuff I was doing was remodeling and integrating old construction with new construction. And there'd be these sometimes, I was always very fussy about if I was doing the framing, but sometimes I wasn't the one doing the framing. So there'd be these big gaps, where you had to transition into the old and the new. So I would use something called, it was a product called Durabond. It was like a hot mud where you'd actually use like a derby because you had these big fills. And hot mud is basically mud that will dry rapidly. So you can put it on thick. And I was always kind of fantasizing when I was doing that sort of thing because it would make these wonderful textures. Like, oh, I should do this with paint, So that's how it kind of got a lot of my experimental stuff happen. And at the same time, I was making my own paint. I would make acrylic dispersion, oil paint, egg tempera, casing. So I just like to experiment with a lot of those kind of mediums. And most paintings in the show are mixed medium, which basically means there's more than one medium in the painting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a few different styles. So you have like the crumb paintings.
Right, the crumb paintings, I call them crumb paintings because I think it's that Norwegian thing where you just don't want to waste anything. So oftentimes I'll use a muller to make my paint, which is it's a piece of glass that's shaped with a handle. You put on your hand and you can do a circular motion on a braided glass, and it mixes the medium, whatever you're using. Let's say it's egg tempera, so it'd be egg yolk in distilled water, and then when you're done, you don't use all the paint, so you have this pigment that's on the glass that I would scrape up, and then I would save it, and then eventually I would use those crumbs to make a painting. So, and some are they're not in this show, but I have some that are really heavily textured. They're like not very big paintings, but they weigh about 25 pounds because there's so much pigment in them. But they're just different, So,
yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
And then you said that you cut your paintings apart and put them.
Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes it's almost like paintings that maybe don't work entirely. I maybe will cut them up and rearrange them. Mm-hmm. And when I initially started painting, I would have scraps of mat board, and I would paint on those or do experiments on those. And then later, many, many years later, probably 30 years later, a lot of this would sit in a drawer for 20, 30 years without me even looking at them. I kind of rediscovered them, and then what I did is I would bond them to something called, it's aluminum composite panel, which is basically a thin piece of plastic with two very, very thin pieces of aluminum, probably as thin as a pop can. Uh-huh. And that is a relatively new product. It's probably been around maybe 20 years, but it's very stable. It's more stable than masonite. Mm-hmm. So I would use a product called Biva 371 film. It's basically a dry mount reversible archival adhesive to adhere the matte museum board. So it's 100% matte or 100% rag content matte museum board to the aluminum composite panel. So, and sometimes I'll do it with canvas. And pretty much all these works are, except for the ones under glass, are either museum board or canvas mounted to aluminum composite panel.
So what are the works that are under glass?
They're all egg tempera, but I did that for an earlier show, and they're actually mounted to foam core.
Okay.
Yeah, foam core is much lighter, even though aluminum composite panels are pretty heavy, but it just adds a lot of weight if you're going to do the whole. And I would probably do, if I was going to do it under glass again, I would probably use aluminum composite panel.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And when you think about painting, oil painting is so much mean, the support that's usually used is canvas, and canvas on a stretcher or a strainer. A strainer is basically a stretcher that it isn't key, you can't move it. But it's actually a terrible, terrible product for painting, because what you want with oil painting, you want something that doesn't move. So aluminum composite panel or even masonry is much better support than canvas.
Yeah.
So
evolving with the times, right?
Right, yeah. Right.
So what inspires you to create?
Well, I think initially it was, nature or something you see, but now I think as I've gotten older, it's about the process of painting, and even I mix my own paint. I have like 3 big shelves of just pigment. So just looking at that is an inspiration. It's like, how would that color relate to that color? So that's a lot about what it's about now. So I'm interested in, I like modern painting because there's that element of chance, there's an element of craftsmanship, there's an element of control, there's a big element of on-control, and then trying to make it all work so it becomes, a unified whole. There's artists that like Helen Frankenthaler, which you would drip her paint, or Morris Lewis, who would do the same sort of thing. And I guess so. There's aspects of not so much pouring, but there's maybe applying the paint with unconventional tools like a taping knife, or I've even made some ways to spread paint out of glass, because they temperature dries super fast. So that's a very good way to do it, because you can spread it with the glass and then take it off with a like a razor blade.
Oh, okay. So
a lot of these paintings have it's a built-up surface, and then sometimes it's scraped back down. Mm-hmm. And then it's built up again. And so there's always an addition and a subtraction. It's almost like, sometimes you're almost destroying it. They're not in this show, but there's some paintings where I've scraped them so hard where the surface has actually, been, scarred. And I don't mind that, I guess. So, yeah, right. So.
Very cool. Is there anything else you want to talk about, or?
Maybe to talk a little bit about the mediums. So a lot of these paintings start out with maybe egg tempera, which is just, like I said before, it's just egg yolk and distilled water. The other medium I use a lot, which is no longer available, it was created by Leonard Bocour, Bocour, back in I think it's early 40s. And that is basically an acrylic resin. And what's nice about that is it dries really fast, much faster than oil. And you don't have to worry about the Faberlian principle. In oil painting, you have to, technically you should be always conscious of how much oil content your pigments have. And some pigments absorb a lot of oil and some don't. So you always want to use the low oil absorbed pigments first, and then add. So you always got to be conscious of that when you're painting. Whereas with acrylic dispersion, which is a water-based medium, it's miscible in water, or acrylic resin, which is miscible in the spirits, you don't have to worry about that. Egg tempera, you don't have to worry about that. So there's advantages of those three pigments over oil. The other thing about oil is it takes forever to dry unless you add something to it. Some of the pigments at least.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with how.
I've always liked. There's a book. It was called the Painters Handbook by. His name escapes me now. But it was like my Bible. It was a great big thick book, and I think I read it 3 times. I just really enjoyed it. I just like the chemistry of painting. Yeah. And I think that's what, about making your own paint is about. I don't make oil paint so much anymore just because it's very time consuming, and I don't have a 3-roller mill, which I've been tempted to buy, but they're about $22,000 used, so I probably won't do that. I've been tempted.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Wow, that's impressive that you make all your own.
And I've thought of, I've done a little experimenting with in Fresco, and that's something I want to get into.
Yeah.
Where I wouldn't do it. I've come up with a way where it could be moved. It could be like a very heavy oil painting. It would weigh a lot, but I've come up with a way where it could be moved, and I just think that would really be fun to try.
Have you tried it?
Just a little bit, yeah.
Okay.
Just kind of experiment with it. And there's a place in New York called Kramer Pigments where you can get the pre-made, Fresco and the pit lime and everything you would need for that. So yeah, it's something I want to try.
So that's the direction you think they'll be moving, kind of? Keep doing the abstract, but
yeah, the other thing I like to do would be encaustic. I've done some of that, but that's another nice medium where it dries really fast. I have a studio in the back of this building, but it doesn't have a window that's open that you can open, and I get a little bit worried about using encaustic because if you get the pigment too hot, it can the fumes can be not so great. You got to be a little bit careful about acrylic resin too, because it's basically a pigment that is emulsified in mineral spirits, and some of those are not that great to inhale. Because there's a safer mineral spirits, but in order to emulsify, you have to have use the one that isn't the safer one. So.
carcinogenic one.
Right, yeah, probably. So, Morris Lewis, who used it almost exclusively in these great big drip paintings, he died in his mid-50s, I think. And I think a big reason was probably because he was, what he was painting with didn't have proper ventilation. And he probably smoked too. Most of those guys did. Yeah. So, yeah.
Oh, thanks for chatting.
Yeah, you're welcome.